Hello and welcome to episode 19 of ARM Template Masterclass. This is part 3 of the section on testing. Over the last couple of sessions we've had a look at how we can test our ARM templates. Firstly, using the ARM template toolkit to get some predefined best practice tests against our templates, and then using Pester to test our templates before deployment to check for more specific things and make custom tests. This week, in the last part of the testing section, we're going to have a look at how we can actually test our infrastructure that our ARM template has deployed to check that it is doing what we think it's doing. So in these tests, what we're going to be looking to do is to confirm that what actually got deployed by our ARM template is what we think it is, that it meets all our requirements, and that it is in line with our policies and so on. Now, at the moment, the only way we can really do this is to actually deploy the resources so that we can check them. This obviously isn't ideal in that we have to wait for the resources to be deployed. We have to actually pay some money for the resources as they're running to be able to check them. If there is a problem, we have to recreate them. That's kind of wasted time and money. But at the moment, that is the easiest way to actually validate what we're getting is what we expect. Now, it may be that we can do something in the future using some of the newer tools, such as the what if command, and that might give us some ability to actually test what's going to get deployed before we deploy it, and things like that. But we're going to keep it simple for the moment and look at what's worked for the last few years. And we're going to have a look at how we can write tests to test the infrastructure that's been deployed to check that it is what we think it should be. Okay, so the first test we're going to look at is one I've just called infrastructure tests, and it's going to have a look and check that what we've deployed in terms of Azure resources matches what we think we should be deploying based on our template. Now, this set of tests is going to be very specific to our particular scenario. If you recall, I mentioned in the previous episode, with testing, you're looking to be a lot more specific in what you create your tests to do. So instead of with your templates where you're trying to make them generic, you're trying to be able to pass in parameters and be able to reuse them for lots of different scenarios. With tests, potentially you want to be a lot more focused on writing the tests to actually look for the specific resources that you want to test. So in this example, we're looking to make sure that some of the things we've deployed have been configured correctly. Things like the VNet address space is configured with a particular range, that the VM is a specific size, and so on. Now, you could write a test where you pass in all those different options as parameters and make it very generic, but that's going to take a lot of time to do, and you're going to have to keep tweaking it as you add more properties you want to test and so on. If you wanted to make more generic tests, you absolutely could, but you might find your life is a bit easier, particularly if you are testing specific scenarios, that you make your tests more specific to what you actually want to look for. So looking at the test itself, again, we're back using Pester. We're using the same syntax we used from the previous test. So we've got our describes and our context, which are wrappers around particular sections. And then in this set of tests, we've got 3 specific areas. So this is a fairly sort of simple set of tests. You could expand on this, obviously, as far as you want to go, test as much as you want to test. But we're looking at 3 things. Firstly, we're going to have a look at the resource group and make sure that the resource group we're expecting exists with the name that we're expecting. Then we're going to have a look at some networking, and we're checking 3 things in the networking section. Firstly, we're checking that the virtual network exists. Secondly, we're checking that there is a subnet in that virtual network called public subnet, and then we're checking that the actual subnet has the IP range that we expect, in this case 10.0.20/23. And then lastly, we're doing some testing of virtual machines, where again we're checking that the virtual machine exists. Then we're going to check that it's the size we expect it to be and that it's in the region we expect it to be. So some fairly obvious things that you might want to know about your deployment to make sure that something hasn't gone wrong and your VM hasn't ended up in the wrong region or the wrong size because somebody messed up a parameter or so on. So in terms of how we're doing this, we're just using Pester like before, and then we're combining that with the Azure PowerShell module. The Azure PowerShell module is what gives us the information to test against. So if we look at the resource group section we've got here, the first command I run is get AZ resource group to go and get me the resource group from Azure. So I'm testing against the actual resources that are in Azure. Once I've got that information from Azure, I then pass that into Pester to actually evaluate the information. So in the case of the resource group, if my resource group with that name didn't exist, then I would get null back from the PowerShell commandlets. So what I'm doing is using Pester to compare the value I get back from the PowerShell commandlets to null to check that it's not null. Fairly straightforward. If we look a little bit more complicated though, if we have a look at the test we're doing to check that the Azure subnet is actually got the right IP range. So first we're going to use the getAZ virtual network subnet config command, which will go and grab the subnet information from Azure. And then I actually need to get some specific information from the value that comes back. So in this case, it's the address prefix value. So I'm using another bit of PowerShell there to extract that value and then doing a comparison in Pester to check that the IP range coming back from Azure matches the one I'm expecting. And similar, if we look at the virtual machine and we look at we're going to try to get the hardware profile VM size. So that's a sub-property of a sub-property. Again, we're just pulling the information from Azure, comparing it to what we expect it to be, and passing or failing the test based on that. And so if we just hop over to the command line, and we're going to go ahead and run those tests. I've already logged into the Azure PowerShell using the CLI, so that's what it's going to use to actually talk to it. So we'll run that test, and you can see that nearly everything passes. The only thing that's failed is down here on the virtual machine, where it's telling me that it was expecting a DS1 v2 size, and actually what it's got is an A2 v2. So I know that something's gone wrong there, and I've passed in the wrong VM size somewhere along the line to get that created. So as I said, you could expand these tests to test as much as your infrastructure as you want. It's going to be easier if you keep them very specific to your particular deployment, so you can set all the values you want. But if you want to spend time and try and make them more generic, you can. You just need to balance the value of that against what you're actually getting out of things. So the second example we've got here is a more generic test set. So this is, I've called Azure Audit, and this is designed for use by somebody who wants to actually go in and evaluate resources that are already running in Azure. So these aren't tests necessarily that you would run once you've written and deployed your ARM template, but these are tests perhaps that would be run by maybe somebody in a security function or a compliance function. And what they do is they go and look at a resource group and pull out all the resources in those resource group and test them against specific criteria for compliance and security and so on. So to give you some examples, there's a section in here for virtual machines. So what it will do is it will go and grab all the virtual machines in a resource group, and it will test each of them to check whether they've got the anti-malware extension installed and that they have real-time protection enabled. Then we have another section looking at network security groups. And so they make sure that every VM has a network security group assigned to it, whether that's actually assigned to the network card or assigned to the subnet, but it checks to see there is something protecting those virtual machines, and so on. Now, in the example we've got here, we're looking primarily at things like VMs, storage, and SQL, just to give some examples. But obviously, you can, again, expand these as much as you want. So again, we're using Pester, just like we did before, but because we're trying to make this more generic, things are a bit more complicated. So firstly, we're passing in a parameter to the test. So far, we haven't parameterized our test. In this one, we are passing in a parameter, which is the resource group name, to actually run the test against. And then if we have a look in the first section where we have a look at the virtual machine. So we've got this describe section with the virtual machine test. And you can see the first command there. I'm going off and using the Azure PowerShell commandlets again to get all the VMs in that resource group. So I'm not looking for a specific VM. I'm just asking the PowerShell commandlets to give me all the VMs so I can run my test against them. Then I'm using a for each loop to actually loop through them and test all of those VMs. So because we're writing these Pester tests, they're just PowerShell at the end of the day. We can use all the functionality of PowerShell that we want. So we can use loops and we can run those tests multiple times if we want to. Now, what you'll find is when you actually look at your tests, you get multiple entries, obviously, for each VM. So you need to make sure that you actually label things appropriately. And when you get an error, you know which VM it's referring to. But you can absolutely do that. And so within our for each section, we're then doing some more AZ PowerShell commands to get some extension information from the VM, passing the JSON we get back from that, and then reviewing the properties to check whether the extension we want is installed, real-time protection is running, and so on. And then again, using the normal Pester functions to check whether the value we get back matches the value we expect. Doing something similar for network security groups, again, we've got a for each loop to look at every network interface. But what we have to do is get a bit more complicated here to actually check, because there are two different ways you can apply an NSG. You can apply it at the subnet level or the network level. And we want this test to pass if you've picked one of the two. So there's a bit more PowerShell here where it actually goes and looks for, okay, well, are there any NSGs applied at the at the network card level? Are there any at the subnet level? And then when we actually do our pester comparison, we're actually looking to see whether either of those values are null, and we only fail if they both are. And then we do a few more things like looking at encryption using BitLocker. We check that there aren't any NSGs that have got rules open to all. Check storage accounts have encryption set. Check that SQL databases have got threat detection enabled, and so on. And again, you could expand this test to check whatever you wanted. But this is an example of doing it in a more generic fashion. So I could run this test against any resource group I have in Azure. I could potentially run it on a recurring schedule to get this information collected and delivered to me on a regular basis to check my resources and so on. Now, the example we've got here in terms of the audit actually could be achieved using other methods. So you could use, for example, Azure policy to do something very similar. And that's probably a better way if you're wanting to do this as a sort of a long-term monitoring process. But if you want a quick way to just run some quick tests against your resources and get some results back using the PowerShell and so on, then this is a way you could achieve that. But more importantly, it gives you an example of writing a more generic set of tests that run against your infrastructure. And so if we go back to the CLI and we'll just run these tests again, and you can see I'm passing in to the PowerShell the name of the resource group I want to test against. And it's going to go and run those tests. And again, most of them pass, but I haven't actually BitLocker encrypted this virtual machine, so it's failing on that one. And so there are a couple of examples of how you can run testing against your infrastructure once you've deployed it to actually validate that what you're getting is what you expect to get in your template. And there's ample opportunities there if you want to expand those out, make them more complex, check more details, and so on. If you've got any questions on that area, please stick them in the comments below. I'll be more than happy to answer them. Next week, we're going to be having a look at pipelines. So we're going to see how we can bring together some of the things we've talked about over the last few weeks and put those into a pipeline to automate the building and the testing and the release of our templates and the creation of our resources as part of a CI/CD type process. So hopefully I'll see you all for that episode. Until then, have a great rest of your day.